Good news, Stalkers. I got a hot tip on a massive stash of artifacts. Now, I know we've already made 2 trips into the heart of the zone already, but trust me, this one's gonna be worth it. You know, I can't really say why for sure, but for some reason I get the feeling that this might be the last time we brave the anomaly fields and mutants that make up this harsh landscape. So I hope you've readied yourself for yet another walk on that tightrope that is the Chernobyl exclusion zone, because as most of you know by now, once you're in, there is no turning back. Stalkers, welcome to the zone.
Okay, there's a way through here. Let's hope it leads somewhere a little less deadly.
Like we've covered previously, the development of the first Stalker title was one hell of a roller coaster. GSC Game World had these lofty ideas for what they wanted to implement, but sadly spent a lot of their time just making sure the damn thing would work on launch day. So when the time came to follow up on their success, they essentially took some of the previously unfinished work they had done during SOC's development and created a sequel out of it. And in doing so helped cement the world they had created into the minds of us, the fans. Sure, we would be revisiting most of the locations from the first game, but to be fair, that's kind of what we wanted to do anyways. So if you could call Clear Sky an expansion pack for Shadow of Chernobyl, Call of Pripyat would be those 2 games combined. There would be new guns, new assets, and new locations, but essentially, this is the world of Stalker perfected. Of course, that doesn't mean there are no flaws to be found. This is still a Stalker game after all. It just means the devs finally got a shot at adding most of what was supposed to make it into that first title, plus the kind of fine-tuning you would expect from a sequel. But some of you may be wondering, would this new title solve some of the issues even hardened fans had with the shallow amount of plot delivered in the first 2 games? Well, there's only one way to find out.
Watch out! Controller!
Okay, so remember how Shadow of Chernobyl was light on narrative but heavy on environmental storytelling, and how Clear Sky tried to remedy that? Well, I think for this last entry, the developers said, well, an impossibly thin story worked for us once, maybe it'll work again. Call of Pripyat starts off with a recap of not only the events of the last 2 games, but the zone itself. Oh yeah, and I should probably mention the mod I'm using for this playthrough sort of acts as this intro from the game. So if you plan on using the Arsenal Overhaul mod and you've never played the game before, maybe start up a new game in vanilla first just so you can see this cutscene. I know it's not the most important thing in the world and it'll likely be information you already know anyways, but it helps contextualize things and I kinda like it. And getting back to that intro, like I said before, it tells us about the zone's origins. First, we have the Chernobyl nuclear power plant meltdown, causing the government to cordon off the area around the disaster, dubbing it the exclusion zone. And now that they have themselves 30 kilometers of real estate where the public isn't allowed to go, and even if they were, no one would want to be there anyways, they begin filling the place with research labs and bunkers where all the things governments aren't supposed to do can be conducted in secret. Flash forward 40 years and a massive event takes place that sees all of the army and science personnel within the confines of the zone dying instantly. After this second disaster, scientific expeditions into the zone begin to witness inhuman monsters roaming the landscape, likely those who were unlucky enough to be in the zone when it blew. There's also reports of the environment being twisted and warped. Small pockets of space contain anomalies that can conjure flames or electricity out of nowhere or can crush a person with severely magnified gravity. Which is good enough reason to stay away forever if you ask me, but there is a human component going on here that basically ensures no one ever will. Inside these reality-bending anomalies, people start finding small trinkets with what you might call odd properties to them. Perpetual energy factories, balls of frozen fire, and gravity-defying objects, all small enough to fit in your pocket. These artifacts being such obvious scientific curiosities, everyone from state-sponsored actors to private businesses are willing to pay top dollar for them, which creates an economy of buyers, middlemen, sellers, and the stalkers who venture into the zone to procure these balls of real-life materia. With more and more interest being drawn to the zone, eventually people start testing its limits. One such stalker is Strelok, who in the events of the first game was able to turn off the Brain Scorcher, a giant antenna array that broadcasts some kind of brain-scrambling signal that can turn a regular person into a drooling zombie in no time and acts as an impenetrable field, keeping stalkers from getting to the power plant at the center of the zone. After this barrier was eliminated, the zone's many factions all made a run on the center at once, leading to a massive war. Looking to capitalize on this, the Ukrainian government set up a secret mission that would see several helicopters infiltrating the zone and making a straight line for the center, each one coming from a different angle. These choppers were supposed to be equipped with anti-anomaly measures, and the pilots had maps letting them know where the major anomalies they needed to avoid were. And that operation lasted all of about 5 minutes before each helicopter suffered some kind of technical failure. The government, not being very happy about the millions of dollars of hardware they just scrapped, suspected anyone and everyone. Everything from sabotage to all-out military attacks were considered, but to get any real answers, they were going to need boots on the ground. So they sent in our protagonist, Major Alexander Degtyarev. He was inserted into the zone and given a false identity, the goal being for him to pose as a normal everyday stalker and in doing so blend in enough to get some real info on what's going on. The reasoning there being pretty strong, as your average stalker would like nothing less than to put several bullets into any soldier they come across, and as such probably isn't going to tell them about any anti-military subterfuge they've been involved in. And then the game just sort of starts. And yeah, maybe that was a long time to spend just talking about a game's intro, but trust me, there's a good reason for that. After that intro is finished, the amount of mainline story you come across in your playthrough is, well, it's almost laughable.
So you're the whole expert, eh? Don't worry, you can count on the boys to take the muties out nice and quick.
You take control of the Major as he enters the swamps of Zaton, and your goal is to blend in at the local stalker post made from an old ship. Using that as a base of operations, you venture out inspecting each of the downed helicopters, finding out each one of them suffered some kind of a catastrophic failure. After coming across a black box listing possible evacuation points, you follow the clues to a surviving helicopter pilot and discover the evac will be going down inside the ghost town of Pripyat. Getting there isn't going to be as easy as it sounds, though. Even though the center is technically open now, most of the people who know how to safely get there likely died in that first raid. So we stumble across old documents that point towards a secret underground tunnel connecting Pripyat and Jupiter. To get through it though, we'll need a few buddies to watch our back and a suit with a closed cycle oxygen system because the military in their infinite wisdom flooded the tunnel with toxic gas before they abandoned it. Once through the underground passage, our team gets jumped by a squad of soldiers, forcing the Major to come out of hiding and identifying himself as a member of the Special Forces. He links up with a unit of survivors from the failed Operation Fairway, and so far all the info he's been able to collect is stuff that could have just been assumed from the start. Each helicopter went down, and there isn't evidence that they were attacked, so chalking this all up as a loss, Major Degtyarev and the survivors of the mission decide to jump ship ASAP. But before they do, well, you know what, let's make sure we don't ruin this for everyone. If you're looking to jump into this one blind, make sure to either skip to the timestamp on screen, click past the chapter marked spoilers, or click the link in the description to make sure I don't mess up that first playthrough for you.
What do you think, we're here for fun? Why so trigger happy? Can't you see that we're all friends here? Me and Agent have been through a lot. Trust me on that.
Okay, so our little motley crew is ready to move out when they get a reading on something that's coming their way fast. Thinking it might be a monolith squad or a herd of mutants ready to take them out, everyone digs in and prepares for an all-out fight. And the amount of tension in this is so well done. If you don't already know what's coming, your mind starts trying to expect what the game's going to throw at you next, which could be anything at this point. Well, the moment finally comes, and instead of some kind of a mutated horror, we're joined by Strelok, the main character of the first game and sort of the most important person in the zone.
My name is Strelok.
You're the stalker who disabled the Scorcher?
Yes.
He lets everyone know about what he's been through in the last 2 games, including the hot gossip on sea consciousness and the truth behind the zone's existence. Following from the good ending of SOC, Strelok informs the group that he sort of shot up the only chance they ever had at controlling the zone, and now that it's been unrestrained, it's going to keep growing. Meaning soon it won't just be Russia's problem. In fact, it won't be long till it's all of Europe's problem, and there's nothing that says it won't continue growing from there. But some of the more astute among you might be wondering what the hell became of the whole figure out what shit on the secret military plan storyline. Well, Strelak puts a pin in that too, and it's likely the most anticlimactic wrap-up you've ever seen in your life.
The reasons are obvious.
Strelak explains to these hardened soldiers something even the most green stalker already knows about. Anomalies move around after emissions, so the anomaly charts they had were long outdated before a single chopper even left the tarmac. Now, on one hand, yes, it is cool to see how the military deals with something most people who've spent even a little bit of time in the zone consider to be novice-level info, but we've just spent 30 or so hours on the edge of our seat waiting till we find out what happened to these choppers. And the conclusion to what was built up to be some great mystery ended up being what most Stalker fans would have immediately thought of as a solution, but then disregarded because it was too simple. If you cut out everything in between the beginning intro and this dialogue cutscene, it would go something like, hey, listen, you've got to figure out what happened to these helicopters, they all crashed, and it definitely was not anomalies. It was anomalies. But now that we have the spoilers out of the way, let's link up with the rest of the group and tie this all together.
We must inform the HQ of this as soon as possible.
I'll contact my commanders right after the emission.
Alright, without spoiling anything, I'll just say the conclusion to the Operation Fairway catastrophe is far from satisfying. On the plus side, there is a very late game revelation that will dull the sting a bit, but it's totally unrelated to the story's main thread. That being said, there is a lot about this ending I really liked. My issue is more how they strung me along for the entire runtime of the game, only to wrap up the one and only story we've had so far in a single dialogue box. Then the remaining 20 minutes or so of the game is devoted to a new plot thread introduced so close to the end that you don't have more than 2 conversations about it till you've seen the credits. It seems to me this was yet another aspect of the Stalker series that was meant to be much bigger and more detailed, but had to be trimmed down due to either budget issues, engine issues, or maybe both. So you might assume me shitting on the one and only driving narrative is a negative, and it definitely is, but just like before, you'll be given a lot of smaller side stories to work your way through, and again like before, a lot of these could have served as an even better main storyline if given a little more love and care. Don't get me wrong, I like the idea of a mystery revolving around finding out what happened to the military choppers that crashed, but investigating missing stalkers only to find out a hemoglobin addict is to blame, well, it's much more interesting. If I may be so bold, I think maybe GSC Game World might be misunderstanding their audience here a bit. They did a brilliant job of setting up the zone in the first game, and we love being here, but I think the best way to move forward is to not focus so much on the zone as the driving plot, but instead use it as a backdrop for really interesting stuff to take place in. This is a place where criminals on the run from the law, drug addicts, and pioneering explorers all congregate, and there is likely to be much more human drama here than the zone could ever produce. And if you ask me, much of the appeal here is how little we know about the exclusion zone, and I do get the desire to further flesh it out, but I think each time you do, you risk stripping away a little bit of what makes it so interesting and unique.
Go to hell, freaking muties!
So giving the story here a grade is going to be a little hard. On one end, we have what I would call a great setup and a well-cultivated mystery, but on the other, in my opinion, is a very unsatisfying conclusion to that mystery, so it's far from all bad, but not quite good either. At the risk of being even more of a broken record than I already am, the main story in a Stalker game is always just a thin thread used to pull you through what is an incredible setting. It is totally possible to ignore the main story in one of these games and still have a fulfilling and satisfying experience. A point made all the more clear when you see how many Stalker mods remove any and all story beats only to replace them with smaller side stories and a more free play focus. Something you can actually get with Call of Pripyat in vanilla form, by the way. The free play part, not the missing story part. At the end of the game, you're asked if you want to stay in the zone or leave it. If you choose to stay, you can essentially play the game forever. Artifacts are often reset after emissions, which gives you a theoretically infinite resource to farm, and you will never be so overpowered or so well equipped that a wandering pack of snorks or a single pissed off stalker won't be able to do you in. I think it says a lot about the Stalker fandom that the introduction of this free play feature would work its way into a massive amount of high quality mods for all 3 games. I think that shows what we want here isn't more curated and finely honed stories, although to be honest, we might not hate you for giving us more.
If Boss is over there. Go talk to him.
But instead, a small reason to continue to exist here in a video game world that is unlike anything the medium has ever seen before. So again, I can't really pass judgment on the story here. It's a little more complicated than that, but I will try to condense this into something at least resembling an opinion. Stalker Call of Pripyat, in my opinion, started off strong with a story that seemed like it would clue us into some of the zone's secrets, but when it eventually doesn't, most of your time with the game will have been spent simply living in its world and not interacting with its story. So while I can totally understand being scared off by the initial statement that the story here has a less than satisfying conclusion, just know that is very much par for the course here, and unlike most video games, the main story is not going to be what keeps you here. Damn, I guess that dumbass quote from John Carmack is finally applicable, so let's rework it a little bit. Story in a Stalker game is like story in a porno. It's expected to be there, but it's not exactly why you're there in the first place.
Let's try to get by them without making any noise.
They're waking up! Run!
The first Stalker game set the standard, and when it came time to follow that up, the developers aimed to include all the stuff they originally wanted to see in that maiden voyage. Sadly, Stalker fans weren't quite so accepting when Clear Sky came out, and to be fair, it's understandable why. Much of what Clear Sky did at launch, despite being taken from actual work done on the first title, felt very half-baked. So the big question is, what direction did they take with the third and, at the time of writing, final entry in the series? In front of GSC Game World laid two paths. Heading to the left would have them going back to their roots and further improving the foundation of Shadow of Chernobyl. The right would see them fleshing out some of the more innovative ideas seen in Clear Sky. So which one did they choose? Well, they just sort of ran straight forward in between the two.
So, you managed to drag your ass over here? Bravo!
Stalker Call of Pripyat could be seen as the series' greatest hits, a combination of all the things that worked for both releases living inside one game. In fact, this combination of elements would be so well accepted that most big mods for SOC and CS would basically be made up of fan-made attempts at including Call of Pripyat's mechanics. And there's a lot to cover here, so I'm gonna have to treat you like you're already well versed in this series. If not, I should have a link to my videos covering the previous Stalker games here in the upper right hand corner or in the description. So if you start to feel lost, go ahead and enroll yourself in Chernobyl University to get your master's degree in stalking.
Stop right there! Listen your weapon and don't you move!
One thing that won't be so clear from the start but will eventually show itself is the fact that COP is a much more confined game as far as the setting goes. Of course, we're still inside the Chernobyl exclusion zone, but as Stalkers, we're kind of used to being able to visit several locations within it on our journey. This time around, our adventure will be limited to just 3 areas. You start off in the swampy Zatan, then move on to Jupiter, and eventually the titular dead city Pripyat. Now at first this does sound like a downgrade. After all, the last 2 games featured 10 and 11 unique locations respectively. On top of that, what made both of those earlier titles so appealing is the thought that revisiting old familiar stomping grounds was sort of baked into the development of a Stalker game. Like I mentioned in my Clear Sky video, a lot of what I appreciated about it was the fact that it let me relive my memories in a lot of these locations. I mean, honestly, how many of you guys watched the Stalker 2 trailer and audibly screamed to yourselves when they showed footage of Corden or what looked like the Great Swamps? At least for me, this was always one of the most unique and interesting parts of the franchise. Taking that into consideration, it would be easy to see this as a big downside, and maybe it is at least partly, but on the plus side, these 3 new locations are absolutely massive in scale. It's kind of hard to say for sure, but I would imagine 3 of the smaller spots in previous games, like say Corden, Garbage, and Rostock, could easily fit inside of Zatan alone. So you'll get that same Stalker experience, visiting all kinds of abandoned villages and anomaly fields, only you won't have to sit through any loading screens to get to most of them. Actually, something I never really noticed until sitting down to get my thoughts together for this script is the fact that there aren't any traditional exits or entrances leading from one zone to the other like we're used to in the series. Instead, you can find guides who will lead you in and out of your current area, which isn't exactly bad or good, just something I thought was interesting. But getting back to my original point, these are some incredibly big plots of land to explore. All 3 of these new maps are massive, and each one is jam-packed with places to go and interesting things to see. So I would estimate you won't be missing out on much, if any, potential content when going from those earlier games to this one. But I think the big draw with the more compartmentalized design of those games is being able to drastically change the sort of environment you're in at a moment's notice. If you happen to be tired of the behemoth mounds of scrap and garbage and want a little more color in your life, you could always go to the Red Forest or hop on over to the Army warehouses. Having a good number of zones broken up by loading screens meant the devs could have a lot more freedom with making each one unique as far as color palette and scenery goes, and yeah, that is something you'll miss out on with COP. I don't want to come off as overly negative about this though. Like I said, these are massive areas and they really do have an incredible amount of content squeezed into them. All 3 zones have 1 million landmarks to visit and loot, and several huge anomaly fields for artifact hunting. Mutants still stick to environments they're more tuned to, like bloodsuckers preferring swampy spots for some reason, or boars sticking to more open fields, and you'll definitely have to keep an eye on ruined buildings or anything else that might give natural cover to bandits or monolith fighters. So navigating these large areas should feel exactly like you're used to. These being such huge playable settings, the developers made the well-appreciated decision to include a guide roll to the stalkers who randomly traverse the zone. So if you want to, let's say, visit the boiler anomaly, but you're being dragged down by more than 100 pounds of ammo and gear looted from a mutant versus stalker fight that you may or may not have decided to stay out of, well, you can just find a gathering of stalkers and pay someone a small fare basically to fast travel you there. Oh, and one tiny thing I thought was really cool is the fact that the same group of stalkers that offer to fast travel you to somewhere will load in with you at that location, and then they'll start running back to wherever they were headed in the first place. It's a small touch, but one that I really appreciated. Okay, so I've been blabbing about the game's setting this whole time. I'm sure a few of you are wondering how it actually feels to play the game, and once again, that is sort of a complicated issue.
We await your orders, O Monolith.
On the plus side, the upgrade system from Clear Sky is back, which is awesome for 2 reasons. Not only is it really fun tuning a gun towards your playstyle, but that gives you even more incentive to explore, since the tools required for more advanced upgrades will need to be found before a technician can perform them. I'm also incredibly happy to say that these guys learned from their last release and made sure guns were still usable before you put thousands of dollars into their upgrades, which translates into you're not going to have to worry about spending a good 30 rounds of 5.56 at point blank range before you actually hit something in front of you. This time around, they seem to have included a nice balance to things by making sure really powerful weapons also came with some kind of a downside, like much more kick or lowered magazine capacity. And if you'll remember, one of my complaints in the last video was that some mods, in trying to combat that problem by making guns pretty accurate from the start, well, they ended up making the upgraded forms of those guns pretty damn overpowered, and at the risk of sounding like a total hypocrite, I kind of missed that. Which leads into a bit of criticism. See, the gunplay in Call of Pripyat, while still being fun and very satisfying, just didn't hit those same highs that Clear Sky did. Now, in total honesty, I'm talking about the gunplay resulting from applying the Arsenal Overhaul mod to Clear Sky, so you would assume it's not exactly an apples-to-apples comparison. But I'm actually using a version of Arsenal Overhaul for COP as well. I was so damn impressed with how much this mod's tweaks to gun damage and accuracy added to Clear Sky's gameplay that I immediately pulled the trigger on using that same mod but tuned for its sequel, and I just feel like something's not quite the same here. Guns are certainly more powerful than vanilla Call of Pripyat, but they're just not on that same level of lethality that I saw in CS about a week ago. Even at the highest difficulty, I just wasn't getting that same feeling from popping out of cover and sending 2 well-placed shots to some bandit's chest and seeing him collapse to the floor. It seems like it's taking more shots to down enemies, and that's not the worst thing in the world, but I sort of prefer the more simulation-like gameplay that came from knowing I was never more than 1 or 2 bullets away from seeing this screen. I was able to get my hands on a pump-action shotgun that gave me that one-shot, one-kill sort of feeling, which was nice, but man, I would have loved to have seen that in the rest of my arsenal. Going back and taking a look at the download for Arsenal Overhaul, I noticed that they included some optional changes in a separate folder for stuff like Stalkers all speaking Russian or trader balances, but there was also a realistic damage folder that I must have just skipped over. So if you do install this mod, I would 100% recommend using that add-on. Also, as a fun little aside, AO mod on COP replaces the main menu music with a theme song from one of my all-time favorite horror movies, The Thing, which is just a nice bonus for a mod I was going to recommend anyways. And since I'm obviously unable to stop comparing this game to Clear Sky, hopefully you guys remember that title's approach to gameplay, including a pretty robust faction war system that would have you taking part in a whole lot of big firefights with more than 10 stalkers on each side. Something I thought went absolutely perfectly with Arsenal Overhaul's reworked damage and accuracy models. And sadly, Call of Pripyat ditches the multi-person skirmishes along with a focus on interacting with the zone's factions, something I would flat out call a downside. Now, I know it was a bit annoying being called to some small outpost to help them deal with like 2 blind dogs, but I really enjoyed having clear-cut territories for each faction to inhabit and sort of being able to control who was where. Really though, it's those massive 20-man shootouts that did it for me. Feeling like you're just a small contributor in a larger battle was really cool, and I feel like the wide open areas in COP were just itching to have a few of those taking place in them. You will come across groups of maybe 3 stalkers shooting it out with rivals or mutants, and sure, that is still awesome to see, but it really just does not compare. The emissions from Clear Sky are back and somehow even more terrifying. Not because they're more frequent or because the bigger landscape might mean you're further from cover a lot of the time, although both of those things are still true, but because the AI system, A-Life, seems to be set to maximum randomness in this game. Some of these things may be explainable by mods or me just hitting a weird string of luck with A-Life, but I had a lot of odd stuff happen in this playthrough. At one point, I walked into the Stalker outpost in Zatan to see a man's body just floating through the air, and once I loaded into Yanov Station, and for some reason 2 bandits and a snork had developed some sort of friendship and were just hanging out with each other. Now that is funny because bandits and mutants are not allowed anywhere near the station, but also when the 2 bandits saw me, they ran outside and developed some sort of an infatuation with me and would shoot at me through the walls every time I was visible. I also had mutants attack me and some NPCs during a scripted cutscene on more than one occasion, so factoring random blowouts into the mix makes things real damn interesting. At one point, an mission hit right as I was taking part in a side quest that had me and a group of other stalkers pitted against a controller inside of a tunnel. So not only was my team being brainwashed into seeing me as an enemy, but I couldn't move around to avoid their gunfire or the controller's long-range attacks because leaving the small room I was in would mean instant death via supernatural radiation tornado. And if it wasn't clear by the tone of my voice, these were not complaints here. I have always enjoyed the zone's random nature, and while in any other game stuff like this would rightly be called a downside, in this series it's at least a part of the reason why we love it so much. Continuing with the compliments, I really liked being able to explore Pripyat here. The whole area has this amazingly creepy feeling to it with all kinds of mysteries everywhere you look, and the addition of seeing a city left abandoned for decades really adds to that. The side missions outside of the main story path in COP might be some of the most interesting in the series, but it feels like there's less of them. And on that note, I cleared COP in less time than I typically spend on these games. I'd wager that's due to there being a little less story to get through here, but the lessened number of areas probably plays a role as well. Of course, when I mention a shorter runtime, it's more in terms of a first playthrough. Most of us series vets typically rush through the stories of these games so that we can unlock every location, and at that point the real game starts. Which translates into a potentially infinite series of runs for artifacts so that you can sell them for ammo, which will be spent of course on the next artifact run, fending off fellow stalkers and mutants. Now it's been a while since I free played COP like that, but I don't remember it being noticeably less long than the other entries in the series. How I judge that is I keep a game going for as long as I can until I get disinterested, which usually hits the 100-hour mark no matter which game I'm playing. So I guess take that for what it is, a totally subjective measurement of content that only an idiot or a Stalker fan would use. One of my favorite aspects about any Stalker game is how you end up playing it so differently than you would any other FPS. You don't rush into danger in these games. You find yourself very carefully approaching possible threats here, and out of instinct you'll likely be making most of that approach while moving from cover to cover. You'll start being able to tell when an enemy's packing real long-range heat based solely on the sound of their gunfire, and you definitely won't be running out of that cover without leaning around to make sure the coast is clear, or if you do, it'll be a mistake you won't make again. Well, I have really good news for you. All of that is most definitely back, and it is just as much fun as it's ever been. So at least GSC seems to really understand the core of what players want out of these games. Of course, shooting in a Stalker game can sort of be overemphasized when you watch reviews like this on YouTube. In attempting to make a video that's entertaining to watch, we content creators will probably end up using a lot of footage of us engaging in really fun gunfights or blowing snorks away, but realistically, you'll probably spend more than half of the game with your gun holstered. Which is great, by the way. Getting from one area to another and spending tens of minutes just enjoying the scenery, or even longer than that in your inventory trying to keep things organized, is amazing. It just doesn't make for the best video watching experience. I'd say Clear Sky definitely has the biggest action focus as far as firefights are concerned out of the three, but even then, it's not even a majority of what you'll be doing. I say that for two reasons. First off, to assure you that that is still part of this entry, and second, as a warning. I really don't want to set someone up for disappointment if they install one of these games on my recommendation and find themselves playing something a lot more slow-paced and methodical than what they saw in my video. Like I keep saying, these are games that demand you learn how to play them, and just running around like you would in an FPS blindly shooting just does not cut it here, or in the rare occasion it does, trust me, it will not work for very long. I don't think a lot of first-person shooters out there require the player to scout fights beforehand, manually select fire modes for their guns depending on how far away the enemy is, or take care of a bleeding wound to keep from losing more health. This is a very unique experience, and I doubt very much many titles would even come close to replicating it outside of this series itself and the game specifically trying to emulate this series. But I think this little anecdote will do a much better job describing this game's depth than I ever could. At one point in Call of Pripyat, you'll find one of the down choppers you're looking for, only it crashed in an area surrounded by a minefield. Now, you could certainly just save scum your way to the other side by quick saving every time you move an inch without being blown sky high. Trust me, I've done it. But you could also pull out the bolts you throw to track the boundaries of anomalies and toss them to see where each mine is based on the sound it makes when it hits the ground. The game never once tells you to do this or even hints that it's possible. It sort of just counts on you thinking in real life terms, and that's what makes Stalker so damn special. So even if I focus on negatives here in this video, think of them more as tiny bumps across what is an otherwise smooth surface. The core of a Stalker game is most definitely here, and while I do like some of the mechanics seen in other titles, this is without a doubt an amazing experience in its own right. I bring up the stuff I don't like because the rest is just all the positives I've spent 3 videos listing at this point. Stalker is a series that's carved a small space out for itself, and across all 3 entries you'll find all of the things that makes the series special as a whole. There are small and large differences in how each approaches that core experience, but they all get to the same destination. The point I'm taking a very long time to make here is that grading a single Stalker game is really hard. There's sort of a package deal, and I love that package. And yes, you do have my express permission to use that quote out of context. If Stalker sounds like a fun concept to you, you'll likely enjoy all 3 games, but if it doesn't, there's not going to be a single entry in the series that'll change your mind over another. If you do want to tackle COP, which I 100% recommend you do, I'd suggest something like Arsenal Overhaul mod with the optional gun damage component for a first-time playthrough. And then maybe something like Gunslinger or Misery for a totally different but equally fun experience. But hey, even if you want to go full vanilla, Call of Pripyat is an amazingly atmospheric game that'll just suck you into its world. Like its 2 predecessors, it can be tough to get into, but once you've spent the time learning its tricks, it will reward you with gameplay I truly believe you can't find anywhere else. So if you can, get your hands on Call of Pripyat. Most consider it to be the best game in the series, and it is really damn hard to argue with them. No matter how it stacks up in the franchise, though, it is very much deserving of a playthrough. And if everything I've just said has failed at getting you interested, may I direct your attention to mutated abominations running full speed through a minefield. Enjoy. If you've been watching this series from the beginning, you might have noticed a trend. Each Stalker sequel basically rearranges all the previous game's assets and adds to them just enough to straddle that thin line that separates full-blown sequel and early 2000s expansion pack. And it doesn't take a genius to divine that GSC Game World would have the same approach to Call of Pripyat. Of course, that's not some kind of underhanded jab. Once again, this game was released just a year after its predecessor, and more importantly, we Stalker fans are okay with this method. Not only does it give us a chance to see familiar locations, guns, lighting tricks, and UI elements, but it also helps contribute to the zone feeling like a shared universe across all 3 games. A lot of games that continue past a few entries tend to look for that mascot type of element they can repeat in order to ensure people always associate each release with the last, but by this point in the series, Stalker had embedded its entire visual presentation into our minds. Now, in any other context, I know this would sound like a downside, but you really have to play these games one after the other to experience the effect it has on you. It really is something else. Like I've already mentioned, I'm using the Arsenal Overhaul mod to get footage for this video, and I am happy to say it leaves almost everything that isn't a gun model, scope, suppressor, or sound effect unchanged, which means what you're looking at right now is basically what I saw on release day, except with much better firearms to mess around with. More returning motifs include the typical look for the more recognizable factions in the zone. They may have added some new armor types, or maybe not, really I can't tell, but regardless you will always know whether or not it's duty authoritarians or hippie-ass freedomers coming at you from across the map.
Here's to a good day's work.
This time around, they didn't reuse any locations from the previous 2 games, a fact that truly does sadden me, but on the bright side, these new areas look amazing. Well, I guess Pripyat does sort of count as a reused location, but this is a completely different part of the city than we saw in either of the last games, so technically I'm still correct, which means I can go to sleep tonight not hating myself. Each of these new areas are pretty jam-packed with content like villages, warped landscapes, or abandoned factories, but there's enough empty space in between them to make sure it doesn't feel like a video game level, but instead a real place you might get a look at when pointing Google Earth at some disheveled abandoned town in Eastern Europe. Veterans will probably recognize the same models and textures for trees and grass, which is fine because these were okay enough looking anyways, but they did add new 2D elements like icons for story missions, artifacts, and the rare new firearm, along with some UI elements that I really enjoyed. I think I might have liked Zatan the most out of the 3 new spots because it had the most cool stuff to look at and explore, but trust me, there is stiff competition as far as that goes. That might also be because of the Stalker base Zadovsk, which is a very cool visual with its rusted skeleton sticking out, making it eerily similar to some big animal like a whale being left on some beach shore to rot under the sun. The anomaly fields in this area are just too damn cool with that trademark, almost alien landscape sort of look to them. The coolest being a huge scar left in the earth by what I'm not sure, but it irradiates psychic energy, and getting near it without serious protection will have you hallucinating till your brain basically melts in your head. Right next to the scar, there's a huge, nearly collapsed bridge, and this is another example of the incredible environmental storytelling you can find around every corner in the zone. There are tens of abandoned military vehicles on this bridge, and I don't really know what the hell they're doing there. We do know the military did have a strong presence in the zone before the second disaster and might have been wiped out while crossing the bridge, but the military is also well known for mounting failed assaults on strategic targets in this world. Case in point, the catalyst for this game's story. Now sure, there's probably some kind of dialogue or journal entry that'll explain this, but I love just hypothesizing about it and letting my brain go crazy with the mystery of it all. Now, I have been complimenting Zatan a lot, but that's not to say the area around Jupiter or Pripyat isn't as impressive, but I think there's something about Zatan that just makes it a little more memorable to me. Okay, so admittedly, it's been all upside so far, but there is one really perplexing and, well, disappointing aspect of COP's presentation to consider. Remember my Clear Sky video where I talked about the lighting and God rays being amazing to look at, but really chewing up system resources? Well, it seems like the developers decided the best way to fix that issue is to basically take those features away. Alright, so that might be a little hyperbolic, but these features have been well nerfed at the very least. Even in the early hours of the day, when the sun's at its most attractive angle, lighting in outside locations just looks disappointingly flat. There aren't many dynamic shadows to marvel at anymore, and the God rays might as well not exist. Now, like I said, I most definitely did complain about how much these tricks ate into my FPS last time, but I sort of expected them to maybe tighten the effects up or make them more efficient to run on higher-end hardware. I didn't think they would essentially remove them. Even when I set God rays to their highest setting, I still don't get anywhere near Clear Sky's medium setting. That volumetric dynamic lighting reflecting off the zone really added to Clear Sky's impressive look, and now that they've been either severely crippled or outright removed, you really start to see just how much work they were doing. Now, Call of Pripyat is still a good-looking game for its time, but thanks to its killer-looking volumetric light sources and reflections, Clear Sky looks near on par with a modern game. A point that gets driven home pretty damn hard in COP when a storm starts up and you get to see short flashes of some amazing dynamic shadows and reflections when lightning strikes. I've got to assume the guys at GSC Game World just weren't able to patch the holes in their last lighting system, because I really doubt anyone on the team looked at how flat this game can seem sometimes and thought it was an overall improvement. In a strictly visual sense, this is a pretty crushing blow for someone like me who both loves the Stalker games and is interested in graphical effects, but if I'm being honest, one of the other reasons it sticks out so hard is that it's just about the only flaw I can think of. Call of Pripyat, minus my obsessive lighting complaints, looks incredible. Sure, there are things you may not like about its visual presentation, but those are problems that have been with the series from the start. So maybe it's not really feasible to get mad that this game looks how it does when it's the third entry in a series of games that all basically look just like this. Stalker as a series may look amazing given its small development team, but it's really easy to forget it was a fairly budget title. Even when it was at its most successful, it still would have been considered a financial failure by big corporations like Capcom or EA. And if you ask me, that not only helps mask a lot of my complaints, but amplifies the impressiveness of what was accomplished here. This series went off the beaten path in a lot of ways, but I would argue its presentation is the most outside-of-the-box element in its arsenal. You really didn't have games that looked like this back then, and even now when you do find a title that has a similar style, it's very likely one of the many Stalker clones found on the indie market. So yes, I would have definitely preferred the previous entry's lighting, but other than that, this is the same visually jaw-dropping package you can expect from any game in this franchise. Sure, there are all kinds of problems you could point out, but that feels a little counterproductive. Flat out, these guys were able to accomplish some incredible things here, and as a nerd who appreciates a good-looking game, I'd like to offer a little tip of the hat to a group of dreamers who took a shot at the AAA games industry and actually ended up landing a punishing gut punch on it. Well, fellow Stalkers, I hope you had fun on this deadly little field trip to the zone. This series very well may be one of the most influential game franchises that never had a chance to see mainstream success. Stalker as an intellectual property somehow managed to elevate itself far above mere video game status by inspiring a loyal following of fans who don't just play its games. Stalkers all over the world get together in abandoned factories or empty fields to relive the adventures they had in the zone out here in the real world. And yeah, maybe that's just LARPing, but doesn't it seem way more cool when everyone wears a gas mask and carries a Russian assault rifle? These people also researched the Chernobyl nuclear disaster, and many of them have visited the site themselves based solely on a lower budget video game series released in the early 2000s. Thanks to its inspiration, coming from an already immensely interesting narrative world, Stalker manages to build a complete experience that is far more than just the sum of all of its disparate parts. What you just witnessed over the course of the last 3 videos is a landmark event in the game's medium. I'm sure a good deal of you may have never even heard of these games before coming here, but I can almost guarantee you that something you played today was influenced by them. If you ask me, this right here is something you flat out cannot get outside of these games. A level of immersion and ambiance that is without question unrivaled still to this day. And yes, I know that sounds like fanboy talk, and sure, I most definitely blindly worship at the altar of the Stalker fandom, but I am also someone who actively looks for gaming experiences that pull me into fictional worlds. With every game I put my hands on outside of a select few genres, my end goal is to fall face first into the very setting my character inhabits. I aim to lose myself in some fantasy landscape using the sights, sounds, and atmosphere coming through my screen and speakers as a guide to further get me there. And in following that very ambition, I never, and I mean never, have gotten closer to a game world than I have right here in the zone. When you play these games and start to lose yourself in them, I swear you could squint your eyes just a bit and find yourself there. These games are truly something else, and I severely hope that I've turned at least a few of you into new additions to this cult.
There's something there. Cover me.
Stalker Shadow of Chernobyl set a standard that, as of yet, has never been surpassed. Clear Sky took that foundation and built onto it several more experimental expansions, and then Call of Pripyat took the most successful elements from the two and married them into one incredible package. If you get just one message from this retrospective, make it this. You owe it to yourself to experience one of, if not the most atmospheric, immersive, engaging, and flat-out jaw-dropping pieces of media ever created. And trust me, I know that sounds crazy to say. I mean, think about the ridiculousness of some odd little Ukrainian video game being the best of anything. But I can assure you with 100% certainty that is still very much true. So please, go find one of these games on sale for $5 to $10 on some key reseller, or hell, just hop on over to your favorite BitTorrent tracker and start downloading some disc images. Some of you might not be able to look past the sometimes dated visuals or actively combative mechanics, but for those of you who break through that barrier, you're gonna find yourself in a whole new world. And from that point on, believe me when I say no one will be able to stop you from consuming every single piece of Stalker-related media in existence. Thanks so much for following me down this irradiated path, guys. It's been a real adventure. Sadly though, that adventure has come to an end, but who knows, we may very well cross paths again. Perhaps sooner than you think, and if we do, I think you'll find that it'll be in some eerily similar circumstances. Good hunting, Stalkers.
Take off.
Hey, what's up guys? Thank you very much for accommodating my fan screeching on this series. This retrospective, as you might have picked up by now, means a little more to me than it does to you guys. But if you saw something here you enjoyed, I would appreciate any kind of support you'd be willing to give over on Patreon or here with the YouTube Partner Program. If not, that's cool. Maybe share these videos around and try to indoctrinate more people into the cult of Stalker. Speaking of which, it's been a whole 5 minutes since I last played a Stalker game, so I guess I'll be seeing you all next time. Peace out, guys.